Their fighters never got off the ground. We buried them in concrete and flame. From 28,000 feet above Kyushu, I watched through my bombardier sight as entire squadrons of Japanese aircraft disappeared beneath a carpet of 500-pound bombs. The enemy had been saving these planes for the final battle, hoarding them like treasure for the defense of their homeland. Instead, they became funeral pyres scattered across shattered runways, their wings folded not in preparation for flight, but in final surrender to American steel. My name is Technical Sergeant Robert Dutch Henrikson, and I was the bombardier aboard the B-29 Superfortress Pacific Thunder during the summer of 1945. What I witnessed that day over Kyushu would haunt Japanese military planners and change the course of the Pacific War forever. This is the story of how we destroyed Japan's ability to fight in the air before their pilots could even reach their cockpits. The morning of July 24, 1945, began like any other at our base in Tinian. The tropical sun was already beating down on the coral runway as I walked to the briefing tent, my flight suit sticking to my back in the humid air. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Major Henrikson, our squadron commander, stood before a large map of southern Japan, his pointer aimed at what looked like a cluster of black dots on the island of Kyushu. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of months of preparation. "Today we're going to hit them where it hurts most, their airfields. Intelligence reports indicate the Japanese have been concentrating aircraft at Miyazaki, Oita, and Kanoya airfields in preparation for Operation Ketsugo, their planned defense of the home islands." I leaned forward in my metal folding chair, studying the reconnaissance photographs being passed around. The images showed neat rows of aircraft parked on concrete aprons, fuel trucks positioned nearby, and what appeared to be dozens of revetments carved into the hillsides surrounding each airfield. The Japanese weren't just hiding their planes. They were protecting them like precious gems. The enemy is approximately 300 aircraft spread across these three targets, Major Henrikson continued. Mostly fighters, Zeros, Franks, and some of their newer models. They're being held in reserve for the final push against our invasion force. Today, we make sure they never get that chance. Captain Williams, our pilot, raised his hand. "What about their defenses, sir?" "Expect heavy flak," came the reply. "They've ringed these airfields with anti-aircraft guns, and there are fighter units at bases further inland that might scramble to intercept us. But gentlemen, we're going in with the entire 314th Bombardment Wing, 180 B-29s carrying everything from 500-pound general-purpose bombs to incendiaries. We're going to turn these airfields into parking lots." The briefing continued for another hour, covering weather conditions, navigation checkpoints, and emergency procedures. But my mind kept returning to those reconnaissance photos. Row after row of Japanese aircraft, sitting like ducks on a pond, waiting for a storm they couldn't see coming. At 0800 hours, the first B-29s began their takeoff roll from Tinian's north field. The sound was thunderous, dozens of Radar 3,350 engines roaring to life, pushing 35-ton aircraft into the morning sky. Our turn came at 0815, and I felt the familiar sensation of being pressed back into my seat as Captain Williams advanced the throttles and Pacific Thunder accelerated down the runway. The formation assembly took nearly an hour. One by one, the massive silver bombers joined up at 15,000 feet, their contrails beginning to form in the thin air. From my position in the nose, I could see B-29s stretching to the horizon, wave after wave of American air power heading north toward Japan. The flight to Kyushu took 4 hours. As we climbed to our bombing altitude of 28,000 feet, I ran through my equipment checks one final time. The Norden bomb sight was functioning perfectly, its gyroscopes spinning smoothly as I calibrated the system. Through the clear plexiglass nose, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly below us, its blue surface broken only by the occasional cloud formation. Staff Sergeant Murphy, our radio operator, called out over the intercom, "Bombardier, we're getting reports from the lead aircraft. Initial landfall in 30 minutes. My heart rate quickened. After months of bombing missions against Japanese industrial targets, this felt different. Weren't just destroying factories or oil refineries. We were eliminating Japan's ability to contest the skies above their homeland. Every aircraft we destroyed on the ground was one less kamikaze that could dive into our ships, one less fighter that could attack our bombers. Pilot to crew, Captain Williams announced. We're approaching the Japanese coast. Test your guns and keep your eyes open. The gunners in the rear compartments responded with short bursts from their 50 caliber machine guns. The familiar sound of American weapons being fired in anger always gave me confidence, but today I hoped we wouldn't need them. Our mission was about precision, not air-to-air combat. The coast off Kyushu appeared like a dark line on the horizon, gradually resolving into green hills and coastal plains. From our altitude, Japan looked almost peaceful, a collection of rice paddies, small villages, and winding rivers that seemed untouched by war. But I knew better. Down there, Japanese soldiers were manning anti-aircraft guns. Radar operators were tracking our approach, and fighter pilots were running to their aircraft. Bombardier, this is pilot, Williams called. Can you see the target? I pressed my face to the bomb site, scanning the landscape ahead. There, a large flat area surrounded by hills, with what looked like concrete runways forming a rough triangle. Miyazaki airfield, our primary target. Even from 6 miles up, I could see the distinctive shapes of aircraft parked along the runway edges. Target in sight, I reported. I count at least 60 aircraft on the ground. They're dispersed but not well camouflaged. The Japanese had made a critical error. In their haste to prepare for the American invasion, they had concentrated their aircraft at a handful of airfields, making them perfect targets for mass bombing attacks. What they intended as a strength, having their fighters close together for quick scrambling, had become their greatest vulnerability. Lead bombardier to all aircraft, came the voice of Lieutenant Colonel Stevens over the radio. Begin bomb run in 2 minutes. Maintain formation and bombing altitude. I made final adjustments to the bomb site, accounting for wind speed and direction. The target was growing larger in my viewfinder with each passing second. I could now make out individual aircraft types, the distinctive profiles of Mitsubishi A6M0s, some of the newer Nakajima Ki-84 Franks, and what appeared to be several twin-engine bombers parked near a large hangar. Bomb bay doors open, Williams announced, and I felt the aircraft shudder slightly as the massive doors swung down into the slipstream. Our 10 500-pound general-purpose bombs were now exposed to the cold air at 28,000 feet, ready to begin their deadly journey to the target below. The flak started when we were still 5 miles from the airfield. Black puffs of smoke began appearing around our formation, silent at first, but growing more intense as we approached the target. The Japanese anti-aircraft gunners had found our range, and their 88mm guns were putting up a fierce barrage. Flak at 10 o'clock. Heavy, called out Sergeant Jenkins from the top turret. They're really throwing it up there. A shell exploded close enough to Pacific thunder that I could hear the shrapnel rattle against our fuselage. But Captain Williams held the aircraft steady, maintaining course and altitude as I fine-tuned the bomb site. This was the most dangerous part of any bombing mission, flying straight and level while enemy gunners tried to knock us out of the sky. Through the bomb site, Miyazaki airfield filled my entire field of view. I could see Japanese personnel running between the aircraft, probably trying to start engines and get their fighters airborne. But they were too late. The American bombing formation was already overhead, and there was nowhere to hide. 15 seconds to release, I announced over the intercom. The crosshairs of my bomb sight were perfectly aligned with the center of the airfield. Below me, I could see at least 20 Japanese fighters parked in a neat row along the eastern edge of the main runway. They would be the first to die. 10 seconds. More flak bursts around us, but nothing close enough to throw off our aim. In the distance, I could see the lead aircraft of our formation beginning to drop their bombs. Tiny black specks fell away from the silver B-29s, beginning their long journey to the target. 5 seconds. I pressed the bomb release button and felt Pacific thunder jump upward as 10,000 pounds of high explosives dropped away from our aircraft. Through the bomb site, I watched our bombs begin their descent, joining hundreds of others in a deadly rain off American steel. What happened next was unlike anything I had ever witnessed in 23 previous bombing missions. The first bombs to impact were the 500-pound general-purpose bombs from the lead aircraft. They struck the northern edge of the airfield in a perfect line, each explosion sending up a column of smoke and debris. But these were just the beginning. Within 30 seconds, the entire airfield was covered in explosions. Bombs were impacting every few seconds, each one adding to the growing cloud of smoke and flame that was consuming Miyazaki Airfield. Through my bomb sight, I watched as a direct hit on a fuel truck created a massive fireball that spread to 3 nearby aircraft. The Japanese fighters, so carefully preserved for the final battle, were being incinerated where they sat, muttered Sergeant Murphy over the intercom. Look at that place burn. He was right. The airfield was no longer visible beneath the smoke and flame. Explosions were still occurring as our bombs continued to impact, but now they were joined by secondary explosions as aircraft fuel tanks and ammunition stores were hit. The Japanese had stored everything they needed for extended combat operations, and now it was all going up in smoke. But the most remarkable thing was the silence from below. No Japanese fighters rose to meet us. No aircraft managed to taxi out of the revetments and attempt takeoff. The surprise had been complete, and the enemy response was nothing more than increasingly desperate anti-aircraft fire. "Pilot to bombardier," Williams called. "How does it look down there?" I kept my eyes pressed to the bomb site as we flew past the target. The entire airfield was obscured by smoke, but I could see the glow of fires burning beneath the black cloud. Here and there, aircraft were still visible at the edges of the destruction, some blown completely off the runway, others simply burning where they had been parked. "Target destroyed," I reported. "I count at least 40 aircraft burning. The runway appears to be cratered in multiple places. This airfield is out of commission." But Miyazaki was just the beginning. As we turned southwest toward our secondary target at Kanoya Airfield, I could see other formations of B-29s beginning their bombing runs on targets throughout southern Kyushu. The sky was filled with American bombers, and below us, Japanese airfields were being systematically destroyed. The flight to Kanoya took only 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Through the intercom, I could hear reports from other aircraft in our formation. The bombing of Miyazaki had been even more successful than we had hoped. Reconnaissance aircraft following behind our formation reported that the airfield was completely unusable, with more than 50 aircraft confirmed destroyed on the ground. Kanoya Airfield was larger than Miyazaki, with 3 runways arranged in a triangle and numerous revetments carved into the surrounding hills. Intelligence reports indicated that this was where the Japanese were concentrating their newer aircraft, the Nakajima Ki-84 Franks, and some of the mysterious new jets that had recently appeared in combat. "Bombardier, this is Pilot," Williams announced. "We're beginning our approach to the second target." "What do you see?" I pressed my face to the bomb site and studied the airfield below. Kanoya was a much more sophisticated installation than Miyazaki. The Japanese had obviously spent months preparing defensive positions, and I could see aircraft dispersed in hardened revetments around the perimeter of the field. But they had made the same mistake, concentrating too many valuable aircraft in one location. "I count approximately 70 aircraft," I reported. "Most are in revetments, but there are at least 20 parked in the open near the main hangar complex." The flak over Kanoya was heavier than at Miyazaki. The Japanese defenders had learned from the first attack and were putting up a determined resistance. Black bursts of anti-aircraft fire filled the sky around our formation, and I could see that one of the B-29s in our group had been hit. Smoke was streaming from its number 3 engine, but the aircraft was maintaining formation. "Bomb bay doors open," Williams announced. "Beginning bomb run." This time, our target was the aircraft revetments on the eastern side of the airfield. These hardened positions were designed to protect Japanese aircraft from bombing attacks, but they would also trap the planes when the bombs started falling. The concrete walls that were supposed to provide protection would instead become ovens when hit by incendiary bombs. Through the bomb site, I could see individual aircraft in the revetments. There was a sleek Ki-84 Frank in the nearest position, its camouflaged paint scheme clearly visible even from our altitude. In the next revetment over, what appeared to be one of the new Nakajima Ki-84 jets, its unusual shape unmistakable even from 6 miles up. 30 seconds to release, I announced. The flak was getting heavier. A shell exploded close enough to our aircraft that I could feel the concussion through the fuselage. But Williams held us steady, and I kept the crosshairs of my bomb sight centered in the target. 10 seconds. I pressed the bomb release button and once again felt Pacific thunder jump upward as our bombs dropped away. Through the bomb sight, I watched as our ordnance joined hundreds of others in their deadly descent toward Kanoya airfield. The destruction at Kanoya was even more spectacular than at Miyazaki. The first bombs to impact struck the main hangar complex, sending up a massive fireball that was visible even through the smoke of subsequent explosions. But it was the hits on the aircraft revetments that created the most dramatic effects. Each revetment that took a direct hit became a furnace. The concrete walls that were supposed to protect the aircraft instead contained the explosions, creating tremendous heat and pressure that incinerated everything inside. Through my bomb sight, I watched as one revetment after another erupted in flame, each explosion marking the death of another Japanese aircraft. "My God," whispered Technical Sergeant Anderson, our flight engineer. "They're burning like Roman candles." He was right. The aircraft in the revetments were loaded with fuel and ammunition, and when the bombs hit, they created a chain reaction of explosions that spread from one position to another. Within minutes, the entire eastern edge of Kanoya airfield was a wall of flame. But the most satisfying moment came when our incendiary bombs hit the main fuel storage area. The explosion was enormous, a column of fire that rose thousands of feet into the air, visible even from our altitude. The Japanese had stored enough aviation fuel to keep their aircraft operational for weeks, and now it was all going up in smoke. "Pilot to bombardier," Williams called. "How does the target look?" I kept my eyes on the bomb sight as we flew past Kanoya. The airfield was completely obscured by smoke, but I could see the glow of fires burning throughout the installation. Here and there, aircraft were still visibly at the edges of the destruction, some blown completely out of their revetments, others simply burning skeletons of what had once been formidable fighter aircraft. "Target destroyed," I reported. "I count at least 60 aircraft burning. The runway is cratered, and the fuel storage area is completely destroyed. This airfield is finished." As we turned east toward our final target at Oita airfield, I could see the results of the day's work spread out below us. 3 major airfields were burning, and with them, hundreds of Japanese aircraft that would never again threaten American forces. The sky above southern Kyushu was filled with smoke columns, each one marking another victory for American air power. The flight to Oita took us over some of the most beautiful countryside in Japan. From our altitude, the rice paddies and small villages looked like something from a postcard, unmarked by the war that was raging around them. But I knew that this peaceful appearance was deceptive. Down there, Japanese soldiers were preparing for the final battle, and in the airfields we were attacking, pilots were dying alongside their aircraft. Oita airfield was the smallest of our 3 targets, but intelligence reports indicated that it was where the Japanese were concentrating their most experienced pilots. These were the men who had survived years of combat in the Pacific, the veterans who would lead the final aerial assault against the American invasion force. Today, we would ensure they never got that chance. "Bombardier, this is pilot," Williams announced. "We're approaching the final target." "What do you see?" I pressed my face to the bomb sight and studied the airfield below. Oita was different from the other 2 targets, smaller but more heavily defended. I could see anti-aircraft gun positions ringing the field, and the aircraft were better dispersed than at the previous targets. But they were still there, waiting for us. "I count approximately 40 aircraft," I reported. "Most are in dispersed positions, but there's a concentration of at least 15 near the main runway." The flak over Oita was the heaviest we had encountered all day. The Japanese defenders knew this was their last chance to stop us, and they were putting up everything they had. The sky around our formation was filled with black bursts of anti-aircraft fire, and I could see that several B-29s in our group had been hit. But the formation held together, and we continued our approach to the target. "Bomb bay doors open," Williams announced. Final bomb run of the day. This time, our target was the aircraft dispersed around the perimeter of the airfield. These planes were harder to hit than the ones parked in neat rows at the other targets, but they were still vulnerable to a concentrated bombing attack. Our job was to make sure that none of them survived to fight another day. Through the bomb sight, I could see the individual aircraft clearly. There was a group of Zeros parked near a camouflaged hangar, their distinctive profiles unmistakable even from our altitude. Near the main runway, I could see what appeared to be several of the newer Japanese fighters, their sleek shapes suggesting advanced performance capabilities. 15 seconds to release, I announced. The flak was getting heavier with each passing second. A shell exploded close enough to our aircraft that I could hear shrapnel hitting our fuselage. But Williams held us steady, and I kept the crosshairs centered on the target. 5 seconds. I pressed the bomb release button for the final time that day and felt Pacific Thunder jump upward as our last load of bombs dropped away. Through the bomb sight, I watched as our ordnance joined the final wave of the attack, beginning their descent toward the last major Japanese airfield in southern Kyushu. The destruction at Oita was different from the previous targets, but no less complete. Because the aircraft were more dispersed, the bombing pattern was spread out over a wider area. Instead of the concentrated inferno we had created at Miyazaki and Kanoya, Oita became a patchwork of individual fires and explosions spread across the entire airfield. But the effect was the same. Through my bomb sight, I watched as aircraft after aircraft was hit by our bombs. A Zero took a direct hit and simply disintegrated, its wreckage scattered across 100 yards of runway. A group of fighters parked near a hangar were engulfed in flames when an incendiary bomb ignited their fuel tanks. One by one, the aircraft that represented Japan's last hope for aerial defense were being destroyed. "Pilot to bombardier," Williams called. "How does it look?" I kept my eyes on the target as we flew past Oita. The airfield was covered in smoke and flame, but I could see enough to assess the damage. The runway was cratered in multiple places, the hangar complex was burning, and aircraft were scattered across the field in various stages of destruction. "Target destroyed," he reported. "I count at least 30 aircraft burning. The runway is unusable, and the fuel storage area is on fire. This airfield is finished." As we turned southeast toward home, I took one last look at the destruction we had created. 3 major airfields were burning, and with them more than 200 Japanese aircraft that would never again threaten American forces. The carefully hoarded reserve that Japan had been saving for the final battle was gone, destroyed in a single day of coordinated bombing attacks. The flight back to Tinian was subdued. The adrenaline of combat was wearing off, replaced by the satisfaction of a job well done. Through the intercom, I could hear the crew discussing what they had seen during the bombing runs. Everyone had been impressed by the scale of the destruction, but there was also a sense of soberness about what we had accomplished. "Pilot to crew," Williams announced. "We're about halfway home." "Everyone okay back there?" The responses came back one by one. Despite the heavy flak over all 3 targets, Pacific Thunder had sustained only minor damage. A few small holes in the fuselage, and some damage to the No. 4 engine cowling, but nothing that would prevent us from making it home safely. As we flew south over the Pacific, I began to process what we had accomplished. In a single day, American air power had effectively eliminated Japan's ability to contest the skies above their homeland. The hundreds of aircraft that had been destroyed on the ground represented years of production, thousands of trained pilots, and millions of gallons of irreplaceable aviation fuel. But more than that, we had broken the back of Japanese aerial resistance. The planes we had destroyed were not just aircraft, they were symbols of Japanese defiance, carefully preserved for the final battle that would determine the fate of the home islands. Now they were gone, reduced to burning wreckage scattered across 3 airfields in southern Kyushu. Staff Sergeant Murphy, our radio operator, called out over the intercom, "Bombardier, I'm getting reports from other aircraft in the formation. Preliminary damage assessment shows over 250 aircraft destroyed on the ground, with all 3 airfields rendered unusable." The numbers were staggering. In a single day, we had destroyed more Japanese aircraft than in any previous bombing mission of the war. But I knew that the real significance of what we had accomplished would not be measured in numbers alone. We had eliminated Japan's last hope for mounting an effective aerial defense of their homeland. As Tinian came into view on the horizon, I began to reflect on the day's mission. The destruction we had witnessed was unlike anything I had seen in my previous 23 bombing missions. But there was something different about this attack, something that made it more significant than just another strategic bombing operation. The Japanese aircraft we had destroyed were not just machines of war. They represented the hopes and dreams of a nation that had been fighting for 4 years, believing that their divine wind would somehow turn the tide of battle. The pilots who had died alongside their aircraft were not just enemy combatants. They were young men who had been told that their sacrifice would save their homeland. But as I watched the smoke rising from the 3 airfields, I realized that we had done more than just destroy aircraft. We had eliminated Japan's ability to resist the inevitable. The invasion of the home islands, when it came, would face no aerial opposition. The skies above Japan now belonged to America. Pilot to Bombardier, Williams called. We're beginning our approach to Tinian. How do you feel about today's mission? I thought about his question as I watched the familiar coral runway of Northfield grow larger beneath us. How did I feel? Satisfied, certainly. Proud of what we had accomplished. But also sobered by the scale of destruction we had unleashed. I feel like we've changed the course of the war, I replied. The Japanese were saving those aircraft for the final battle. Now they have nothing left to fight with. As Pacific Thunder touched down on Tinian's runway, I could see the ground crews waiting for us. They would want to hear about the mission, to learn how many aircraft we had destroyed, how heavy the flak had been, whether we had encountered any enemy fighters. But I knew that the real story of this day would be told in the silence that would greet any future American bombing missions over Japan. The sky above the home islands was now empty of enemy aircraft, and it would remain that way until the end of the war. The intelligence air reports that came in over the following days confirmed what we had witnessed from the air. The bombing of Miyazaki, Kanoya, and Oita airfields had been devastatingly effective. More than 250 aircraft had been destroyed on the ground, along with fuel storage facilities, maintenance equipment, and spare parts that could not be replaced. But the numbers only told part of the story. The Japanese military leadership had been counting on these aircraft to mount a final desperate defense against the American invasion. Without them, their entire strategic plan for the defense of the home islands had to be reconsidered. Major Henrikson called us together for a debriefing 3 days after the mission. The intelligence reports were spread across the table, including post-strike reconnaissance photographs that showed the complete destruction of all 3 airfields. Gentlemen, he began, what you accomplished on July 24th was more than just a successful bombing mission. You eliminated Japan's last hope for aerial resistance. The enemy was counting on those aircraft to contest our invasion of the home islands. Now they have nothing left to fight with in the air. The photographs told the story better than any words could. Miyazaki Airfield was a wasteland of cratered runways and burned aircraft. Kanoya looked like Keithy's surface of the moon, with not a single building left intact. Oita was completely unusable, its runway torn apart by bomb craters and its aircraft dispersed in twisted wreckage across the surrounding countryside. But perhaps the most telling photograph was one taken by a reconnaissance aircraft flying over Kyushu the day after our attack. It showed Japanese personnel at a nearby airfield, standing in groups and looking toward the smoke columns that were still rising from the 3 destroyed installations. Even from high altitude, their posture suggested defeat and despair. The enemy's reaction tells us everything we need to know, Major Henrikson continued. They're no event trying to repair these airfields. They know it's over. As satisfying as our victory had been, I couldn't help but think about the cost. The Japanese aircraft we had destroyed represented more than just military hardware. They were the product of years of training, months of preparation, and the hopes of young men who believed they were defending their homeland. The pilots who had died alongside their aircraft were not faceless enemies. They were sons, brothers, and fathers who had been told that their sacrifice would save Japan from invasion. Instead, they had died without ever getting the chance to fight, burned alive in their cockpits, or crushed beneath the debris of collapsed hangars. But I also knew that our mission had ultimately saved lives on both sides. Every Japanese aircraft we destroyed on the ground was one less kamikaze that could dive into an American ship, one less fighter that could attack our bombers. The hundreds of airmen who would have died in aerial combat were now safe, able to return home to their families when the war ended. The invasion of Japan, when it came, would face no aerial opposition. American ground forces would advance under friendly skies, protected by the same B-29s that had destroyed the enemy air force on the ground. The terrible casualties that everyone expected from Operation Downfall might be reduced by the very mission we had flown. In the weeks following our attack on the Kyushu airfields, the effects of our mission became increasingly apparent. Japanese air activity over the home islands dropped to almost nothing. The few aircraft that did appear were clearly older models, probably pulled from training units or reserve storage. The modern fighters that had been destroyed at Miyazaki, Kanoya, and Oita were gone forever. American bombing missions over Japan continued, but they now flew without significant aerial opposition. The massive formations of B-29s that had once faced determined fighter attacks now encountered only scattered anti-aircraft fire. The skies above Japan belonged to America, and everyone knew it. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese military leadership was desperately trying to find ways to replace the lost aircraft, but their industrial capacity was already stretched to the breaking point. The aluminum, steel, and skilled labor required to build modern fighter aircraft were simply not available. Even if they could somehow manufacture new planes, they no longer had the experienced pilots to fly them or the aviation fuel to keep them operational. The attack on the Kyushu airfields had not just destroyed aircraft, it had broken the back of Japanese air power. The carefully constructed defense plan that had taken years to develop was now worthless, and there was no time to create a new one. As I write this account many years later, I am struck by how quickly the war ended after our mission. The atomic bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki just 2 weeks later brought Japan to its knees, but I believe our destruction of their air force was equally important in forcing their surrender. The Japanese military leadership knew that they could not defend their homeland without air cover. The aircraft we destroyed on July 24th represented their last hope for mounting an effective resistance to the American invasion. When those planes went up in smoke, so did Japan's ability to continue the war. The young men who died in those burning aircraft were not cowards or fanatics. They were soldiers who had been prepared to give their lives for their country. Instead, they died without ever getting the chance to fight, victims of a war that their leaders should have ended long before American bombers appeared over their homeland. But I also know that our mission saved countless lives on both sides. Every Japanese pilot who died on the ground was one less kamikaze who could crash into an American ship. Every aircraft we destroyed was one less threat to our bombers and fighter escorts. The terrible casualties that everyone expected from the invasion of Japan were avoided, in part because of the mission we flew that day. The most profound memory I carry from that day is not the sight of burning aircraft or the sound of exploding bombs. It is the silence that followed our attack, the complete absence of Japanese fighters rising to meet us, the empty skies over what had once been their most important airfields. For 4 years, American airmen had fought their way across the Pacific, engaging Japanese fighters over every island and atoll. We had learned to respect their skill and determination, even as we fought to defeat them. But on July 24, 1945, that long aerial battle finally came to an end. The Japanese fighters never got off the ground because we had buried them in concrete and flame. The men who had been trained to fly them died alongside their aircraft, victims of a war that had already been lost. The skies above Japan fell silent, and they would remain that way until the end of the war. As Pacific Thunder landed back at Tinian that evening, I knew that we had witnessed something historic. We had not just completed another bombing mission, we had ended Japan's ability to fight in the air. The war would continue for a few more weeks, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The silence we had created over the airfields of Kyushu spoke louder than any words could. Japan's last hope for aerial resistance had been destroyed, and with it, their ability to defend their homeland. The divine wind had been extinguished by American steel and determination, and the Pacific War was finally coming to an end. In the end, that silence was the sound of victory, complete, decisive, and final. The Japanese aircraft that had been saved for the final battle would never fly again, and the young men who had been prepared to die for their emperor had perished for nothing. It was a terrible price to pay for defeat, but it was a price that finally brought peace to the Pacific. Their fighters never got off the ground because we had buried them in concrete and flame. And in that burial, we had buried Japan's last hope for victory, ensuring that American forces would soon stand victorious on the soil of the rising sun.